My name is Ruby. I'm 34 years old, and for most of my life, I've been described with words like steady, reliable, and my personal favorite, low maintenance. I live in Seattle now. I work as a compliance analyst for a mid-sized logistics firm. It's not glamorous, it's not loud, but it requires attention to detail, patience, and the ability to sit quietly with information until it tells you the truth. If you met me at a family dinner, you probably wouldn't notice me right away. I'm the one refilling water glasses, clearing plates before anyone asks, smiling when conversations get tense. I've always been the easy daughter, the reasonable sister, the one who doesn't make things complicated. People tend to underestimate women like me. They mistake calm for passivity. They confuse silence with ignorance. They assume that because you don't interrupt, you don't see. This story isn't about revenge, and it's not about dramatic confrontations or explosive betrayals. It's about something quieter than that, something colder, something that unfolds slowly enough that at first you don't even realize it's happening. It began with a sentence. My sister accused me of stealing until I played the CCTV footage at dinner. That's the headline version. The clean version. The one that sounds sharp and satisfying, but the truth is heavier. The truth started long before that dinner. Long before the accusation. Long before I realized I had been assigned a role in my own family. A role I never agreed to play. This story is about being underestimated until the underestimation becomes a liability. It's about how disrespect rarely arrives as a storm. It arrives as a pattern. Small dismissals, soft jokes, raised eyebrows, assumptions that calcify over time. And it's about what happens when someone who has always chosen peace decides, quietly, to choose clarity instead. There were no shouting matches, no slammed doors, no dramatic ultimatums, just documentation, timing, and one dinner table. By the end of it, the truth tasted better than the meal. If you've ever been the easy one in your family, have you ever wondered what would happen if you stopped being convenient? In my family, I was the stable one. Not the brilliant one, not the dramatic one, not the fragile one. Just stable. My younger sister, Madison, had always been the magnetic one. She was 5 years younger than me, loud in a way that people found charming, the kind of person who could turn a grocery store line into an audience. Growing up, teachers called her a natural leader. Relatives called her spirited. Strangers called her unforgettable. I was the other thing. Ruby's so mature. Ruby doesn't need much attention. Ruby's fine. It wasn't said unkindly. That's the complicated part. No one in my family thought they were overlooking me. They genuinely believed they were complimenting me. When Madison forgot her homework, it was stressful. When she forgot to pay someone back, it was absent-mindedness. When she interrupted me mid-sentence, it was enthusiasm. When I stayed quiet, it was expected. At family gatherings, I naturally drifted toward the kitchen. I plated desserts. I refilled wine glasses. I made sure Mom didn't overexert herself. It wasn't martyrdom, it was efficiency. I noticed what needed doing, and I did it. And because I did it without complaint, it became invisible. If Madison arrived late, everyone waited. If I arrived early, no one noticed. There's a strange erosion that happens when you're consistently perceived as low maintenance. People stop checking in. They assume you're self-sustaining. They assume you don't bruise. I don't think my parents loved me less. I think they trusted me more. And somehow that trust translated into less protection. Madison borrowed things without asking sometimes. Clothes, jewelry. Once, even my car was out for an afternoon when hers was in the shop. She always returned them. Eventually, with a laugh and a story. "You don't mind, right?" she'd say, already halfway out the door. And I would shrug. Because technically I didn't mind. What I minded was the assumption. There was a running joke in our extended family that if anything went wrong, Ruby would figure it out. I was the contingency plan, the quiet safety net, the reliable background infrastructure of our family ecosystem. And infrastructure, by definition, isn't celebrated. It's used. By the time we were adults, the roles had calcified. Madison worked in marketing, flashy campaigns, brand launches, influencer events. She posted polished photos online. She had engagement parties and curated brunches. I had spreadsheets, audit trails, secure files. At dinners, Madison told stories. I listened. And somewhere along the way, listening turned into a kind of invisibility. Not the tragic kind, the practical kind. The kind where if something went missing, people might assume you had access to it. The kind where if someone needed a responsible scapegoat, someone calm enough not to explode, you would be the safest option. I didn't know that yet. At that point in my life, I still believed that being steady was protection. That if you were reasonable enough, fair enough, composed enough, people would naturally extend the same respect back to you. I thought competence shielded you from suspicion. I was wrong. The first cut didn't feel like a wound. It felt like a joke. It happened on a Sunday afternoon at my parents' house. One of those long, lazy dinners where the conversation drifts from real estate prices to someone's coworker's divorce to whether anyone wants more mashed potatoes. Madison had just come back from a weekend trip to Napa with friends. She was glowing in that curated way. New handbag, fresh manicure, stories polished for maximum entertainment. At some point between the salad course and dessert, she realized her bracelet was missing. It was delicate, gold, a gift from her fiancé. She touched her wrist mid-sentence, froze, and then laughed lightly. "Oh my God, I think I left my bracelet somewhere." The table paused. My mother looked concerned. My dad frowned. Madison retraced her weekend out loud. Winery, hotel, brunch, Uber. Then she turned to me. "Ruby, you were in my apartment on Friday, right? When you dropped off those documents for Dad?" I nodded. I had stopped by to leave some insurance paperwork on her kitchen counter while she was packing. "You didn't happen to move anything on my dresser, did you?" The way she asked it was almost casual, almost harmless. The room went still in that subtle way families do when something potentially uncomfortable brushes the air. "I left the folder on the kitchen island," I said calmly. "I didn't go into your bedroom." She tilted her head, studying me, not accusing, just assessing. Okay. I just remember taking it off before I showered, and you're like the only person who was there after that." There it was. Not a statement, an implication. No one reacted sharply. My mom immediately said, "Oh, honey, I'm sure it'll turn up." My dad waved his hand dismissively. "Probably in your car." Madison smiled again, as if to soften it. Yeah, I'm sure. Ruby wouldn't—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. Ruby wouldn't what? Take it? Move it? Misplace it and forget to mention it? The implication lingered thin but present. I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, not even embarrassment, just awareness. Because this wasn't about the bracelet. It was about probability. In Madison's mind, I was the most logical explanation. Not because I'd ever taken anything in my life, not because I'd ever been careless with her belongings, but because I had access, and because I was quiet enough not to erupt at the suggestion. If she had hinted at one of her friends, there would have been outrage, defensive laughter, text messages fired off immediately. With me, there was safety. I smiled. "I didn't see it, but check your bathroom drawer. You always set jewelry down there." She blinked, slightly surprised by the precision of my answer. "Oh, right." Conversation resumed. The tension dissolved. 40 minutes later, she found it. It had slipped behind her makeup organizer. She held it up triumphantly. "Found it! See? I'm just dramatic." Everyone laughed. No one looked at me. No one said, "Sorry for implying." Because technically no one had accused me. That's the thing about small cuts. They don't bleed publicly. They leave thin, almost invisible lines beneath the skin. And I remember thinking that night, driving home in the rain, hands steady on the wheel, if something bigger ever went missing, would the implication still be that soft? Or would it finally have a name? After the bracelet incident, nothing changed, which in hindsight was the real signal. If something genuinely unsettles a family, it lingers. It gets revisited, clarified, softened with reassurance. But this, it dissolved like steam off a plate. And because it dissolved, it became precedent. The next few months were uneventful on the surface. Madison's wedding planning accelerated. There were venue tours, cake tastings, and seating chart debates. My parents were emotionally and financially invested. The extended family buzzed in group chats. I helped where I could. I reviewed vendor contracts when Madison felt overwhelmed by the fine print. I flagged cancellation clauses she hadn't noticed. I reorganized her budget spreadsheet after she accidentally double-counted deposits. She praised me for it. "You're literally the only reason this wedding is staying on budget," she'd say, laughing. "I'd be bankrupt without you." It sounded affectionate, appreciative even. But appreciation without respect has a strange flavor. One evening, while we were sorting through floral invoices at her apartment, she tossed her phone onto the counter and sighed dramatically. "Ugh, my planner thinks someone accessed my shared vendor folder and downloaded files." She glanced at me casually. "You didn't open anything weird, right? You're like techie." "I'm not techie," I said evenly. "I just read contracts." She smiled. "Same difference." I kept my expression neutral. "No, I haven't accessed anything besides what you sent me directly." Okay, just checking." Again, just checking. There was always a softness to it. A buffer, a laugh, a shrug. She never said, "I think you did this." She said, "You didn't, right?" The burden of disproving suspicion was always mine. And because I was calm, because I answered without visible offense, the pattern continued. At a bridal shower brunch, her future mother-in-law joked about someone misplacing an envelope with cash gifts. Madison laughed and said lightly, "Well, Ruby's the organized one. If anyone knows where it went, she does." People chuckled. I hadn't even touched the gift table, but I smiled, because correcting it would have seemed defensive, and defensiveness would have felt disproportionate. That's how normalization works. It doesn't escalate dramatically. It repeats quietly. Little assumptions, little glances, little just checking moments. And each time I told myself the same thing. She doesn't mean it. She's stressed. She's overwhelmed. She's impulsive, not malicious. I rationalized it because it was easier than confronting it, easier than disrupting the family equilibrium. I told myself that stability mattered more than pride. But something else was happening beneath that rationalization. I started paying attention, not emotionally, structurally. I noticed how quickly narratives formed in a room, how people filled in blanks based on personality, not evidence. Madison was spontaneous, so her mistakes were charming. I was precise, so any irregularity connected to me must be intentional. The logic was flawed, but it was consistent, and consistency is data. One night, alone in my apartment, I replayed the bracelet moment in my mind, the folder comment, the shared drive question, the bridal shower joke. None of them was explosive. But together, they created a story about me that I had never agreed to. Not a thief, but adjacent to suspicion. Safe enough to question, calm enough to absorb it, responsible enough not to retaliate. And I realized something uncomfortable. The role I occupied wasn't accidental anymore. It was convenient. For everyone, including Madison. I still believed I could outgrow it simply by continuing to be reasonable. I hadn't yet considered another possibility. That reasonableness in the wrong environment becomes permission. It's strange how you can live inside a role for years before you realize it was written for you by someone else. For most of my life, I thought I had chosen to be steady, chosen to be calm, chosen to be the one who absorbed tension instead of amplifying it. But sometime after the third, just checking, I started to see the pattern more clearly. I wasn't just the reliable one. I was the designated container. If something was misplaced, I was the most convenient person to question. If something went wrong, I was the safest person to imply. If Madison felt anxious, I was the calm surface she could project it onto. And because I never exploded, the role felt justified. There's a subtle power dynamic in families that doesn't look like power at all. It looks like personality. It looks like temperament. It looks like that's just how she is. Madison was expressive. I was composed. Madison was reactive. I was reflective. So when tension entered a room, it bent toward me. At her engagement party, a small but expensive box containing custom wedding cufflinks went missing for 20 minutes. The best man panicked. Madison scanned the room with growing agitation. "Ruby, can you check the coat room? You're good at finding things." Not, "Did you take it?" Not, "Where did you put it?" Just an assumption that I would locate the problem. I checked the coat room, the bathroom, under the gift table. I found it tucked behind a floral arrangement where Madison herself had placed it earlier while taking photos. When I handed it back to her, she laughed breathlessly. "See, I told you she'd figure it out." Applause, relief, gratitude. But something inside me had shifted. I wasn't the solution, I was the system. And systems don't get credit, they get used. Later that night, standing by the kitchen island while guests mingled, I caught my reflection in the dark window. Neutral expression, controlled posture, observing more than participating. It occurred to me that no one in that room had ever considered what it would look like if I weren't calm. They didn't imagine me angry, or wronged, or falsely accused. They imagined me capable of handling suspicion, capable of managing stress, capable of cleaning up emotional messes. And capability over time becomes an obligation. The role was clear now. I was the reliable backdrop against which Madison's personality shone brighter. I was the rational counterweight to her chaos, and if a narrative ever required a responsible adult who could withstand doubt without imploding, that would be me. The frightening part wasn't that Madison suspected me in small ways. It was that everyone else accepted the possibility so easily. Not because they believed I would steal, but because, in their minds, I could survive the suspicion. There's a dangerous assumption hidden inside that logic, that strong people don't fracture. Those composed people don't resent. Those quiet people don't keep score. They do. They just don't announce it. Driving home that night, I felt something unfamiliar settle into place. Not anger, not hurt. Clarity. If I were going to occupy a role in this family, I wanted to understand its boundaries, its risks, its a long-term cost. Because the next time suspicion entered a room, I had a feeling it wouldn't be about cufflinks, and I needed to know whether I would keep playing the system or redesign it. The shift didn't happen during a fight. It happened on a Tuesday. No raised voices, no dramatic confrontation, just a small, quiet moment that rearranged something fundamental inside me. Madison had asked me to stop by her apartment while she was at work. A package was arriving, designer shoes for her honeymoon, and she didn't trust the building's mailroom. I worked remotely that day, so I agreed. When I let myself in, the apartment was half chaos, half luxury. Open garment bags draped over dining chairs, wedding decor samples stacked on the coffee table. A ring light was still plugged in from whatever content she had filmed that morning. I signed for the package and set it on the kitchen island. That should have been the end of it. But as I turned to leave, I noticed something small near the entryway console. A security camera. New, compact, mounted high in the corner. I recognized the model immediately. I had reviewed similar systems for corporate compliance cases, angle range, storage capacity, and remote access features. It was discreet but powerful. Madison hadn't mentioned installing cameras. For a moment, I simply stood there, not offended, not suspicious, just aware. The camera lens faced the main living area, capturing the front door, kitchen island, and hallway to the bedrooms. It would have recorded me entering, signing for the package, walking through the space. It would have recorded everything. I felt something unexpected, relief. Not because I thought I was being monitored unfairly, but because for the first time, there was an objective witness in a space where narratives often bent toward implication. I opened my phone and checked the time, 2:14 p.m. Then I did something subtle. I took out my own slim black notebook, the one I carry everywhere, and wrote it down. March 12th. Entered Madison's apartment at 2:09 p.m., signed for package, left at 2:17 p.m., security camera installed above entry console. Not dramatic, not accusatory, just data. As I locked the door behind me, I realized the shift had already happened. For years, I had responded emotionally, internally, to these small implications. I processed them privately, rationalized them, absorbed them. But that afternoon, my instinct wasn't emotional. It was structural. If narratives could form without evidence, then evidence would become my anchor. I didn't plan revenge. I didn't anticipate catastrophe. I simply recognized a pattern and adjusted my posture within it. Documentation wasn't paranoia, it was clarity. That night, Madison texted me, "Hey, did the shoes come?" "Yes," I replied. Signed at 2:14, left them on the island. 3 dots appeared almost immediately. Perfect, thanks, you're the best. I stared at the screen for a moment. You're the best. The phrase used to warm me. That night it felt transactional, because being the best meant being available, being calm, being convenient. But something else had quietly entered the equation now. I wasn't just available, I was aware. And awareness changes everything. It changes the way you enter rooms. It changes the way you answer questions. It changes the way you interpret silence. I didn't know yet that the camera in her apartment would matter. I didn't know that weeks later, a much bigger accusation would surface. But I did know this. If suspicion ever escalated beyond soft jokes and just checking, I would not rely on tone, memory, or emotional credibility. I would rely on proof. And for the first time in my life, I understood that silence could be more than restraint. It could be preparation. After that Tuesday, I didn't become colder. I became quieter. There's a difference. Before, my silence had been instinctive, automatic. A personality trait shaped by years of being the steady one. But now, it was deliberate. I began noticing how often I filled gaps for other people. When Madison forgot details, I supplied them. When my parents misremembered timelines, I corrected them gently. When confusion surfaced, I smoothed it over before it solidified. I stopped doing that, not in a dramatic way, not in a punitive way. I simply allowed pauses to exist. If someone misremembered something, I let the inaccuracy hang for a few seconds before clarifying. If Madison joked about my robotic memory, I smiled and didn't defend myself. If a question hovered in the air with faint suspicion beneath it, I answered it directly, without cushioning it. The absence of cushioning unsettled people more than anger ever would have. At a family brunch, my dad mentioned that Madison had been handling most of the wedding payments herself. Madison laughed. Well, Ruby checks everything before I send it. I took a sip of coffee. Only the contracts you forward to me, I said evenly. A small pause. It wasn't accusatory, it wasn't sharp, but it was precise. Madison glanced at me briefly, recalibrating. Silence, I realized, had been mistaken for softness. Now, without changing my tone, I let it become a boundary. Around this time, Madison started venting more about stress. Vendors were miscommunicating. Deposits were getting tangled. One afternoon, she called me, voice tight. I think someone moved money out of my wedding account. Why do you think that? I asked calmly. Because the balance is off. By how much? She hesitated. I don't know, a few hundred? Have you reconciled it with the vendor invoices? Silence on the other end. No. Start there. Before, I would have offered to log in and review it myself. This time, I didn't. She sighed. Okay. We hung up. An hour later, she texted, false alarm, I forgot about the florist's second deposit. No apology, no acknowledgement of the direction her mind had briefly traveled. But I noticed something subtle in myself. The old version of me would have felt a small sting at the implication. The new version cataloged it, not emotionally. Structurally, I began keeping simple records. Dates I visited her apartment, messages about finances, shared document access timestamps. It wasn't obsessive, it was clean, factual, a timeline of interactions. And the more I documented, the calmer I felt, because I understood something that hadn't fully crystallized before. When people rely on personality to determine credibility, the quiet person loses. But when events rely on evidence, personality becomes irrelevant. Madison continued mistaking my calm for compliance. She would tease, You're so unbothered. I swear nothing phases you. That wasn't true. I was bothered. I just stopped reacting in ways that benefited anyone but me. There's a misconception that silence equals weakness. That if you're not correcting every slight in real time, you're surrendering. But sometimes silence is reconnaissance. Sometimes it's the space where you watch patterns complete themselves. And sometimes it's the only way to let people show you exactly who they believe you are. Weeks passed like this. Calm on the surface, data beneath. I didn't know what would trigger the next escalation, but I knew something would. Because patterns don't disappear when ignored. They mature, and when they do, they stop asking politely. What they never noticed was that I had stopped defending myself in conversations, because I was preparing to defend myself in reality. There's a difference. Over the next several weeks, Madison's apartment became a quiet access point. Wedding deliveries, vendor pickups, dress fittings. I was in and out occasionally, always at her request. Each time I documented it. Date, time, purpose. Not emotionally, just mechanically. What they didn't see was how natural this was for me. In my job, compliance isn't dramatic. It's methodical. You assume nothing. You verify everything. You build trails that don't rely on memory or personality. So I applied the same discipline to my personal life. When Madison texted, "Can you grab the invitation samples from my desk?" I replied, "Yes," entering at 6:42 p.m. When she asked me to return a dress to a boutique, I took a photo of the receipt and sent it immediately. Not defensive, transparent. She occasionally teased me for it. "You're so official," she'd laugh. "It's not a court case." I would smile lightly. Habit? But what I was really doing was balancing an invisible scale. Because the more I replayed those small implications in my mind, the bracelet, the shared folder, the missing envelope, the more I understood something unsettling. If something significant went missing, I wouldn't just be a possibility. I would be the easiest explanation, not because I was reckless, not because I was desperate, but because I was accessible. And accessibility without boundaries invites projection. Around this time, I started paying attention to something else. Madison's patterns under stress. When she felt overwhelmed, she externalized quickly. When she felt embarrassed, she redirected subtly. When she made a mistake, she searched for a narrative that preserved her competence. It wasn't malicious, it was instinct. But instinct becomes dangerous when combined with an audience willing to believe it. At a family dinner one evening, Madison mentioned casually that she'd misplaced a small envelope containing honeymoon cash gifts. She said it with a half laugh, scanning faces. "Don't look at me," I said lightly before anyone else could. "I haven't been to your place this week." There was a brief silence. I hadn't raised my voice, I hadn't accused her of anything, but I had preempted the implication. Madison blinked, recalculating again. I didn't mean—" "I know," I said gently, and I did know. She didn't consciously mean to assign blame. She just reached for the most stable surface in the room. Me. What they never noticed was that my silence had evolved into positioning. I began asking subtle questions in neutral tones. Who else had access? When did you last see it? Have you checked the footage? The word footage always made her pause. She had installed 2 additional cameras by then, one in the living room, one near the hallway leading to her bedroom. "Yeah," she'd say casually. "I mean, I haven't checked yet." I would nod, because I knew something she hadn't fully internalized. Cameras don't care about personality. They don't interpret tone. They don't assume intent. They don't bend toward charisma. They record, and recording levels in the field. I wasn't waiting for a downfall. I wasn't plotting a dramatic reveal. I was ensuring that if a moment ever arrived where implication turned into accusation, I would not rely on memory alone. I would rely on timestamps. There's a calm that comes with preparation. It's not anxiety. It's not paranoia. It's knowing that if someone ever says your name in the wrong tone, you can respond without raising your voice. Weeks passed. The wedding approached. Tension rose. And then one Friday evening, Madison called me with a voice that was no longer teasing. It was sharp, controlled, and edged with something that sounded very close to certainty. "Ruby," she said, "we need to talk." When Madison said, "We need to talk," she didn't sound frantic. She sounded composed. That was what unsettled me. There's a particular stillness in someone's voice when they believe they've already assembled the story in their head. When they're not asking questions anymore, just preparing to present conclusions. "I'm at home," she said. "Can you come over?" I checked the time automatically, 7:18 p.m. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. The drive was quiet. No music, no mental rehearsals, just awareness. When I walked into her apartment, the air felt dense, not explosive, dense. Her fiancé, Daniel, was there too, sitting at the kitchen island, arms folded, not angry, concerned. Madison stood near the living room camera. "There's something missing," she said. "What?" I asked evenly. "My emergency wedding fund, the cash envelope." The room didn't move. "How much?" I asked. 3,000. Daniel shifted slightly but stayed silent. I felt the weight of the number, not because of the money, but because of what it represented. $3,000 is large enough to feel intentional, large enough to justify escalation. "When did you last see it?" I asked. "Wednesday night," she replied quickly. "I had it in the top drawer of my dresser." "And who's been here since then?" She hesitated. "Just you," she said. There it was. Not implied, stated. The word didn't echo. It settled. I let the silence stretch, not as punishment, but as measurement. "You're saying I took it," I said calmly. "I'm saying," she corrected, "that you were the only one here." Daniel finally spoke. "We're not accusing. We just need clarity." Clarity. It was almost poetic. I nodded once. "Okay." Madison crossed her arms, defensive now. "I checked everywhere. It's gone." "And you checked the cameras?" I asked. A flicker passed across her face. "Not yet." "Why not?" "Because I didn't think—" She stopped herself. "You didn't think what?" I asked gently. She exhaled sharply. "I didn't think I needed to." The realization landed slowly. She had built a narrative strong enough in her mind that footage felt secondary. That was the private reveal, not the accusation, not the amount of money, but the order of operations. In her mind, personality came before proof. I looked at the camera mounted above the living room shelf. "Let's check," I said. Daniel stood immediately, almost relieved by the practicality of it. Madison hesitated, then grabbed her phone and opened the surveillance app. Her fingers trembled slightly, not from fear, I think, but from confrontation with uncertainty. She scrolled to Wednesday. The three of us stood shoulder to shoulder, staring at her phone screen. There I was, Wednesday, 6:41 p.m. Entering with a garment bag she'd asked me to pick up from the tailor. Timestamp clear. I walked through the living room, set the bag on the couch, moved toward the hallway, out of frame briefly while placing it in her bedroom, returned to the kitchen, checked my phone, left at 6:49 p.m. No detours, no drawer openings, no lingering. We watched it twice. Silence thickened. Madison's jaw tightened. "That's just the living room." "There's a hallway camera," I said quietly. She switched feeds. There it was again. A different angle. Clearer view of the bedroom doorway. The footage showed me stepping in, placing the garment bag on the bed, and walking straight back out. 8 minutes total. No dresser interaction. No top drawer. Nothing. The room felt colder. Daniel exhaled slowly. "Okay." Madison swallowed. "That doesn't mean—" she started, then stopped. "Doesn't mean what?" The evidence was clear. Undeniable. And for the first time since the bracelet incident, I saw something in her eyes I hadn't seen before. Not guilt. Not yet. Uncertainty. Because the narrative she had assembled so neatly, Ruby was here, Ruby is calm, Ruby could have done it, had just fractured quietly under timestamps. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt clear. "Is there any other day you want to check?" I asked evenly. She shook her head slowly. The truth had not been dramatic. It had simply been recorded. And in that moment, standing under her own surveillance system, Madison realized something she hadn't fully understood before. I was no longer absorbing suspicion. I was requiring verification. After we watched the footage, the room didn't explode. It deflated. Madison set her phone down slowly on the kitchen island. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, processing. The air felt fragile now, not tense, but exposed. No one apologized. Not immediately. Because an apology requires a full internal admission, and Madison wasn't there yet. She was recalculating. "I don't understand," she murmured, more to herself than to me. "It was there." I nodded once. Then something else happened. It would have been easy to press harder, to demand clarity, to force her to say the words, "I thought you took it." But escalation wasn't my goal. Clarity was. In that moment, I had options. Option 1. Leave it here. Let the footage quietly correct the narrative. Accept the unspoken apology and move forward as if this were just another misunderstanding. Option 2. Confront her directly. Ask why I was the only plausible explanation. Force the pattern into the open. Option 3. Wait. Not passively, strategically. Something about her confidence before checking the cameras lingered in my mind. The way she had called me with certainty was already assembled. She hadn't sounded confused. She had sounded resolved. Which meant this wasn't just about missing money. It was about narrative gravity. I looked at Madison carefully. "When did you realize it was gone?" "Today," she said quickly. "I was moving things around in the dresser." "And your fiancé hasn't accessed that drawer?" Daniel shook his head immediately. No. Has anyone else been here? Cleaner? Friends? She hesitated again. Just me, she said quietly. There was something in the pause. I recognized it, not as guilt, but as defensiveness turning inward. I made my decision then, not loudly, not dramatically. I chose the irreversible path. I chose to stop protecting her from the implications of her own assumptions. For years, I had cushioned moments like this, smoothed edges, allowed narratives to dissolve without consequence. This time, I would not escalate, but I would not erase it either. I'm going to send you the timestamps from my phone, I said calmly, just so you have them documented. Her eyes flicked up, slight discomfort. Okay. And I'd recommend you download the footage from Wednesday in case you need it later. For what? She asked, a touch sharper now. For clarity, I replied evenly. Daniel nodded subtly, almost in agreement. Madison crossed her arms again, but this time it wasn't defensive. It was unsettled, because documentation shifts responsibility. If there was proof I didn't take it, then the missing money required a new explanation. And new explanations often lead somewhere inconvenient. I didn't mean to imply, she began. You did, I said gently. The words weren't loud. They weren't angry, but they were firm. And that's okay, I continued. We all go to the most convenient explanation first. She looked at me carefully, trying to read whether there was accusation beneath my tone. There wasn't. Just acknowledgement. And acknowledgement is harder to deflect than anger. That was the irreversible choice. Not revenge, not humiliation, but refusing to let the implication evaporate. From that moment forward, there would be a record of the footage, of the timeline, of the conversation. If this pattern continued, it would no longer exist in shadows. It would exist in data. Madison nodded slowly. I'll keep looking. I'm sure you will, I said. And as I left her apartment that night, I understood something with quiet certainty. This wasn't the end of it. Because when a narrative fractures publicly, even in a small room with just 3 people, it doesn't disappear. It searches for another place to land. After that night, I didn't call anyone. I didn't text my parents. I didn't tell a friend. I didn't even journal about it beyond updating the timeline. That was the shift. Before, I would have processed it emotionally, tried to understand Madison's mindset, her stress, her fear. This time, I processed it structurally. The next morning, I emailed Madison. Subject line, Wednesday visit. Timestamp confirmation. No accusation, no commentary. Just a concise summary. Entered apartment at 6:41 p.m. Placed the garment bag in the bedroom. Exited at 6:49 p.m. Confirmed via living room and hallway camera footage. Attached were 2 still screenshots with visible timestamps. Sharing for your records, I wrote at the end. Let me know if you need anything else clarified. The tone was professional, not sisterly, she replied 3 hours later. Got it. Thanks. Nothing more. But silence after documentation feels different than silence after implication. Over the next week, something subtle shifted in the family dynamic. Not publicly, energetically. Madison became slightly more cautious around me, less teasing, fewer just checking jokes. There was a carefulness in her tone, as if she now understood that assumptions might require evidence. But tension doesn't evaporate just because it's challenged. It relocates. 3 days later, my mother called. Sweetheart, she began gently. Madison mentioned the money situation. She's very stressed. I'm aware, I said calmly. She said there was some confusion about who had been in the apartment. There it was. Narrative gravity. Even with footage, even with timestamps, the story had drifted outward, softened into confusion. I sent her the footage confirmation, I replied evenly. Yes, she said that, of course. We know you would never... There was that unfinished sentence again. I appreciate that, I said, but I'd prefer we rely on what we know, not what we assume. A pause. My mother wasn't defensive. She was unsettled, because I had never spoken like that before. I just want peace before the wedding, she said quietly. So do I replied, and I meant it. Peace, however, requires accuracy. That week, I made another quiet move. I requested, in writing, that any future access to Madison's apartment for deliveries or errands be accompanied by a text confirmation before and after entry. Not because I feared wrongdoing, because I refused ambiguity. She responded with a thumbs-up emoji. To her, it likely felt like formality. To me, it was insulation. At work, I often explain to clients that compliance isn't about distrust. It's about clarity. It prevents misunderstandings from becoming liabilities. I was now applying the same principle at home. No raised voices. No ultimatums. Just structure. Madison eventually found part of the missing money. $2,000 tucked inside a shoebox in her closet. Money she had moved temporarily while reorganizing decor supplies. The remaining $1,000 was still unaccounted for. She texted me casually. Found most of it, LOL. I must have been tired. I stared at the message for a long moment. No acknowledgement of the accusation, no recognition of the footage, just relief wrapped in casualness. That was when I understood something with sharp clarity. She wanted the story to reset, to quietly return to equilibrium, to pretend the fracture had never happened. And I had to decide, would I allow it to? Because sometimes moving in silence isn't about proving innocence. It's about choosing when the truth will finally be heard. And I already knew the setting. It would not be private. It would not be whispered. It would be at a table where narrative couldn't hide behind convenience. The consequences didn't begin with confrontation. They began with distance. Subtle at first, Madison stopped asking me to run errands. She stopped forwarding contracts for review. The late night, "Can you check this?" text disappeared. On the surface, it looked like independence. Underneath, it felt like caution. When someone realizes you are no longer absorbent, they become careful about what they spill near you. At Sunday dinner the following week, the atmosphere was slightly rearranged. Madison was animated as usual, recounting a cake-tasting disaster. My parents laughed on cue. But when I entered the room, there was a flicker of awareness. Not hostility, awareness. The missing money had not been publicly discussed, but my mother's phone call had told me enough. The narrative had circulated in softened form. Some confusion, stress, timing overlap, language that avoids accountability. Halfway through dinner, my aunt mentioned how expensive weddings had become. Madison sighed dramatically. "Tell me about it. I literally almost lost part of my emergency fund last week." The table quieted slightly. I kept my posture relaxed, fork steady. "Oh?" my father asked. "Yeah," she continued, light tone but sharpened edges. "I thought someone might have, moved it." Someone. My mother shot her a small warning glance. I felt the old pattern trying to reassemble itself. Vague implication. Shared understanding. Safe silence. This was the moment when I used to look down at my plate. Instead, I looked up. "You did think that," I said calmly. The room shifted. Madison's smile tightened. "I said I was stressed." "And we checked the footage," I continued evenly. It clarified the timeline. My father blinked. "Footage?" Madison inhaled sharply. "It's not a big deal." "It wasn't," I said. "Once we reviewed the CCTV, the word landed differently in a family dining room than in a corporate office. CCTV. Clinical. Undeniable. Daniel cleared his throat softly. "We watched it together. It showed exactly what happened." "What happened?" my aunt asked. "That Ruby dropped off a garment bag and left," Daniel said. 8 minutes total. The silence that followed wasn't explosive. It was recalibrating. Because now the narrative had structure. My mother's expression changed, not toward me, but toward Madison. "You told me it was confusion," she said quietly. "It was," Madison insisted, but her voice lacked its earlier buoyancy. I was overwhelmed." No one accused her of anything. No one raised their voice. But something irreversible had occurred. The implication had been spoken aloud and corrected aloud. And once a correction enters a public space, it changes the hierarchy of credibility. Madison wasn't humiliated, but she was exposed to accountability. Dinner resumed. Conversation drifted elsewhere. But the energy had altered. For the first time, I wasn't the invisible stabilizer. I was the factual center of a corrected story. After dessert, my father pulled me aside. "I didn't know she thought that," he said quietly. "I know," I replied. He nodded slowly. "You handled it well." That was the first time anyone had acknowledged handling, not just assuming it. Across the room, Madison laughed a little too loudly at something Daniel said, but her eyes flicked toward me more than once, not with anger, with calculation, because she understood now that the implication no longer dissolved quietly. It required verification, and verification, once introduced, spreads. Consequences rarely arrive as punishment. They arrive as shifts in perception. And perception, once adjusted, is difficult to reverse. After that dinner, Madison tried to reset the tone. Not dramatically, not with a grand apology, just small gestures designed to smooth the surface. She sent me a link to bridesmaid dresses with a heart emoji. She tagged me in an old childhood photo on social media. Caption, "My built-in best friend." Public warmth, private omission. I responded politely. I didn't withdraw. I didn't retaliate. But something fundamental had shifted, and she could feel it. Because the dynamic she relied on, my automatic containment of discomfort, was gone. A week later, she called me again. This time, her voice didn't carry certainty. It carried nerves. "Can we talk?" she asked. "I'm free now," I said. There was a pause before she began. I think I handled that money thing badly." It was the closest she had come to direct acknowledgement. "I was overwhelmed," she continued. "Everything felt out of control. And when I couldn't find it, You looked for the most logical explanation," I finished gently. "Yes," she exhaled. "And you were the only one who'd been there." There it was again. Logic without examination. "I understand stress," I said calmly, "but stress doesn't excuse certainty." Silence. "I wasn't certain," she protested weakly. "You called me to your apartment," I replied. "You had Daniel there. You told him I was the only one with access." Her breath caught slightly. She hadn't realized I knew that part. Because Daniel had told my father. And my father, unsettled by the dinner conversation, had mentioned it to me quietly. Narratives leak, and once they do, you can't reseal them. "I didn't mean for it to go that far," she said. "I know," I answered, and I did. Madison wasn't malicious. She was reactive, defensive, used to being emotionally buffered. But intention doesn't erase impact. There was a small, fragile pause. "I'm sorry," she said finally. The word landed gently. I didn't rush to reassure her. "Thank you," I replied. Another silence. I need you to know I don't think you'd ever steal from me." I let that sit between us. "Then why was I the first explanation?" I asked quietly. She didn't answer immediately. Because the answer wasn't about money. It was about roles. For years, positioning me as stable enough to withstand doubt. "I don't know," she admitted. And that was the most honest thing she had said so far. The problem was, by the time honesty arrives, perception has already shifted. Our parents had heard about the accusation. Daniel had watched the footage. The extended family had absorbed fragments of the dinner conversation. Even if Madison rewrote the story now, the original implication had existed. And existence leaves residue. You can't unimply someone. You can't retract the moment you chose them as the most convenient suspect. "I accept your apology," I said calmly. "But we need structure going forward." "Structure?" she echoed, wary. "Yes, clear communication, documented access, no assumptions without verification." She laughed softly, uncomfortable. "It sounds like a contract." "It is," I said evenly, "just not a legal one." She didn't argue, because she understood something now that she hadn't before. The dynamic was no longer elastic. It wouldn't stretch back into its old shape. And once accountability becomes part of a relationship, you can't pretend it was never needed. Some fractures can be repaired. Others can only be acknowledged. By the time Madison apologized, the family had already seen what happens when implication meets evidence. And that knowledge doesn't disappear. It lingers, quietly. The real confrontation didn't happen over the phone. It happened at dinner. 2 weeks before the wedding, my parents hosted a formal family meal. Extended relatives, Daniel's parents. A long table dressed in linen and careful optimism. Madison looked radiant, controlled, smiling with intention. I arrived on time as usual. There was an unspoken agreement in the room. Tonight would be smooth. No tension, no references to stress. Just a celebration. Halfway through the main course, Daniel's mother mentioned how fortunate Madison was to have such a supportive sister. Madison reached for her wine glass. "Oh, Ruby's always been the responsible one. She practically audited my entire wedding." Polite laughter. I smiled faintly. Then Daniel's father, curious and unaware of context, asked lightly, "Didn't you have some kind of scare with the wedding fund recently?" There it was. Not dramatic, but public. Madison hesitated. Just a second. I felt the room waiting. This was the moment. Not explosive, not hostile. Clarifying. "Yes," I said before she could redirect. My tone was even, conversational. Madison thought the emergency envelope was missing. Madison's jaw tightened slightly. I continued calmly. "We reviewed the CCTV footage from Wednesday night. It confirmed my visit was 8 minutes, drop-off only, no drawer access, no embellishment, no accusation. Just facts. Daniel nodded once in quiet confirmation. His father blinked. Ah, good thing for cameras. Yes, I agreed. They're helpful when memory gets crowded. The sentence wasn't sharp, but it wasn't soft either. Madison set her glass down carefully. I was stressed, she said lightly. I shouldn't have jumped to conclusions. There it was, not whispered, not diluted, stated. My mother exhaled subtly. Daniel's mother smiled politely. Weddings do that. The conversation moved on, but something fundamental had just occurred. For the first time in our lives, the pattern had been named in a room where it couldn't be quietly revised later. No one was humiliated. No one was shouted down. There was no dramatic exposure, just alignment. After dessert, Madison stepped onto the patio. I followed a few minutes later. The air was cool. City lights flickered beyond the yard. You didn't have to say it like that, she said, not angry, just unsettled. I said it exactly as it happened, I replied. She crossed her arms, mirroring an old habit. It made me look careless. I met her gaze steadily. You were. Not cruel, not raised, just accurate. Silence stretched between us. I apologized, she said. I accepted, I answered, but an apology doesn't erase the event. She studied me carefully. You've changed. No, I said softly. I've clarified. Her shoulders lowered slightly. For years, confrontation in our family meant raised voices or emotional withdrawal. This was neither. This was a temperature-controlled truth. And temperature-controlled truth is harder to dismiss than anger. We stood there for a moment longer. No explosion, no tears, just two sisters recalibrating the space between them. When we returned inside, nothing looked different. But everything was. After the wedding, life didn't fracture. It realigned. Madison and I didn't become distant. We didn't become dramatically closer either. What we became was clearer. Clarity is quieter than reconciliation. It doesn't require emotional speeches. It requires adjusted behavior. Madison no longer makes just checking comments. If something goes missing, she checks first, verifies, reviews. And if she asks me a question, it comes without implication attached. That shift alone changed everything. Our parents, too, began treating me differently. Not with guilt, but with recognition. My father now asks for my opinion in front of others, not privately after the fact. My mother is more careful with her language. Fewer unfinished sentences, fewer assumptions disguised as reassurance. I didn't demand this. I demonstrated it. There's a misconception that dominance requires volume, that strength requires confrontation. It doesn't. Sometimes dominance is simply refusing to carry narratives that aren't yours. I'm still steady, still calm, still the one who arrives early and notices what needs doing. But I no longer confuse steadiness with self-erasure. If someone implies something, I ask for clarification. If someone assumes something, I request verification. And I do it without heat. That's the difference. I don't need to raise my voice because I trust documentation more than emotion. I don't need to humiliate anyone because accuracy speaks louder than outrage. The night I played the CCTV footage at dinner wasn't dramatic. There were no gasps, no slammed forks, just timestamps, 8 minutes, no drawer, no theft. And in that quiet exposure, something inside me settled permanently. For years, I believed being the easy one protected relationships. Now I understand that clarity protects them better. Madison once asked me, months after the wedding, "Did you ever think I actually believed you stole it?" I considered the question carefully. "No," I said. "I think you believed it was possible." She nodded slowly. And that difference between believing someone is guilty and believing they are capable of guilt is where roles are built. I no longer occupy that role. Not because I demanded respect, but because I required proof. The truth tasted better than the meal that night. Not because it humiliated her, but because it nourished me. It restored something I hadn't realized was slowly eroding, my narrative ownership. I am still Ruby, still observant, still composed. But now, when I enter a room, I don't brace for implication. I bring clarity with me. And clarity, once introduced, doesn't leave quietly. I didn't win anything that night. There was no trophy, no dramatic apology scene, no cinematic silence where everyone suddenly saw me differently. What happened was smaller and more permanent. For years, I thought being calm meant absorbing doubt. I thought being the mature one meant allowing other people's stress to spill onto me without protest. I believed that if I just stayed reasonable enough, steady enough, respectful enough, people would eventually return that same precision. But respect built on personality is fragile. Respect built on clarity is durable. When my sister accused me, softly at first, then directly, I had two options. I could argue, or I could verify. I chose verification, not to embarrass her, not to prove superiority, but to protect the truth from becoming optional. There's something powerful about playing CCTV footage at a dinner table, not because it's dramatic, but because it removes interpretation. It replaces tone with timestamps. It replaces implication with evidence. And in that quiet moment, when the screen showed 8 minutes and nothing more, the balance shifted. The truth tasted better than the meal, not because someone else choked on it, but because I no longer had to swallow doubt. If you've ever been the reliable one, the calm one, the person everyone assumes can handle suspicion without flinching, I want you to remember this. Silence is powerful, but unverified silence can become a role you never agreed to play. You don't have to explode to be strong. You don't have to be humiliated to be heard. You don't have to become loud to become clear. Sometimes the most dominant thing you can do is press play. So I'll leave you with this. Have you ever been quietly assigned a role in your family or workplace that didn't belong to you? And if the moment came, would you argue? Or would you let the evidence speak?